Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on Act 20 and MLSS. This session is recorded, so feel free to type any questions that come up during the presentation in the chat, and there will also be an opportunity to unmute and ask additional questions at the end of the slide presentation. Today's slides are accessible in the chat, and at this time, I just want to introduce myself and my co-presenters today. So my name is Dawn Mirth Johnson, and I'm an education consultant for DPI. I'm a speech-language pathologist, and at DPI support speech-language and also assistive technology. And I'm pleased to have with me today Alyssa Wattina and Ann Berry. So Ann, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ann Berry, and I am the coordinator for the speech and related service providers at Racine Unified School District. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, and my name is Alyssa Wattina. I'm also an SLP and I'm employed by UW-Milwaukee. And I currently serve as a project manager and statewide coordinator for the WISCA grant, which is the Wisconsin Collective for Comprehensive Assessment Grant. And we provide professional learning and continuous improvement supports for districts and CESAs across the state.
Thank you, Alyssa and Ann, and thank you for being here. They have both been instrumental in helping develop some guidance that we have been putting out from DPI, including what we're talking about today, along with a number of other committee members who have just been instrumental, like I said, in helping support guidance development across the state. So today's agenda includes an overview of Act 20 and some key resources. We're going to talk about students with IEPs in Act 20 and also about administering literacy assessments for students with low incidence disabilities and complex communication needs. We're going to introduce you to a new document that will be out soon that we've been working on at DPI and with various partners across the state. We will also be talking about multi-level systems of support today and the role of the SLP and some FAQs that some frequently asked questions we receive often about MLSS and our role. And we'll be able to answer some of your questions then at the end as well. So let's jump right in. On this first slide, we have included several resources related to Act 20 that are available on the DPI website. If you go to the DPI website and you type in Wisconsin Reads, you'll get to the main page that also has all of these resources. We've also listed some resources related to dyslexia and IEP development that connect to implementing Act 20 requirements for students with IEPs, including a document on the role of medical and clinical information, which is often received for students from outside providers recommending IEPs or certain therapy type prescriptions. So that will be a helpful resource for you. Diving into Act 20, the main components of Act 20 include a definition of science-based early literacy instruction, the requirement for a single statewide reading readiness screener, diagnostic reading assessment, and a personal reading plan. So those are the main components, and there are a lot of other parts to the actual implementation of Act 20. And again, you can go to that Wisconsin Reads site for a link for more information. Science-based early reading instruction is defined as instruction that's systematic and explicit and consists of the areas listed here on this slide. It's important to keep in mind that all students deserve access to science-based early reading instruction, including our students with IEPs. As you likely know, according to Act 20, by July 1st of 2025, so that's this summer, teachers 5K through grade 3, including reading, special education, multilingual learner teachers, must begin a training from the list of accredited independent teacher trainings that was compiled by the Center for Effective Reading Instruction. Also by that time, principals, district reading specialists must have completed a training that meets specific criteria that is outlined in the Act. Each district does have the authority to determine how they will interpret this. As speech-language pathologists, we are not mandated to participate in the training. However, in looking at this list, think about the parts of the definition of science-based early literacy instruction that also overlap with our area of practice. So people that are in roles that are not mandated to take these trainings can still take the trainings and can still contribute meaningful input to discussions related to literacy development. It's also a way to show the rest of your teammates what you know and understand about language and literacy, and then learn from them as they're learning about what they will be teaching the students. So let's look a little closer at the Act 20 components of screening, diagnostics, and development of that personal reading plan. Act 20 states that learners in 4K must be evaluated on phonemic awareness and letter sound knowledge. Act 20 states that learners in 5K through grade 3 must be evaluated on phonemic awareness, decoding skills, alphabet knowledge, letter sound knowledge, and oral vocabulary. Those are all part of the screening. So 4K is mandated to take part in the screening in the fall and the spring. Grades 1 through 3, kindergarten actually through 3, in fall, mid-year, and spring. So in 5K through 3rd grade, students that score below the 25th percentile must be engaged in a diagnostic assessment. There is no parent or caregiver opt-out for the screening, and there's no alternate assessment for the screening. The purpose of the screening is to quickly and accurately identify which students are at risk of or struggling in reading. So what happens when we have students who may not be able to accurately take that screening? So if an IEP team determines that the effects of a student's disability will prevent them from obtaining a valid assessment result, that student would be considered to be at risk as a result of the universal screening assessment. So teams can decide to advance directly to diagnostic assessment in grades 5K through 3rd grade. That is part of the law that's built in. So in a rare case, an IEP team may determine, based on those effects of disability, that those results may be invalid. So we will look at those students already as at risk, and we'll advance directly to that diagnostic. And we're going to talk a little bit more coming up about a new document that's coming out to help you to perform that diagnostic assessment. The team should really give careful consideration to the selection of the diagnostic assessment measures in a case such as this. Here's a screenshot of the sample form language that is now included on the I-7 form related to district-wide assessment. This is where an IEP team would indicate the decision to advance to diagnostic assessment. So keep in mind for the screening, there may not be much you can do as far as accommodations. You really have to go to the AIMS website and look at what Pearson allows, because any accommodations will invalidate that screening. But when you get to the diagnostic assessment, some of those accommodations that you typically might use for students with IEPs could then be utilized, and this is where you would include those in the IEP. So when a student scores below the 25th percentile on the required Act 20 reading screener for any of the areas listed, the next step is the diagnostic assessment and the development of a personal reading plan. The diagnostic assessment is completed in general education, so it's not completed by a speech-language pathologist or other special education staff. However, there are times when we may assist in that testing and help to get the most accurate data. There are some important things to consider regarding the diagnostic, that there's no provision to opt students out of diagnostic. IEP teams may decide in advance to go directly to the diagnostic without that screening. The LEA or your district has flexibility in selecting the diagnostics that you use. And keep in mind that the purpose of the diagnostic is to lead to development of that personal reading plan and to allow all students the opportunity to read. The result of the additional reading assessment measures can then be considered. So the information gathered is really intended to assist with developing that personal reading plan. So reading assessments should include measures that are accurate actionable, and information about the reading skills and instructional needs of that child. Act 20 does not prohibit the consideration of additional reading assessment measures. So what is meant by diagnostic? The items noted with an asterisk on this slide are those that were included as part of that screening. But keep in mind, if you've decided to advance directly to that diagnostic, you still have to assess these areas. The other areas listed are what are required to be part of the diagnostic reading assessment. So Act 20 states that a diagnostic reading assessment administered to students identified as at risk on the screener must include rapid naming, phonological awareness, word recognition, spelling, vocabulary, listening comprehension, and when developmentally appropriate, oral reading fluency and reading comprehension that you see at the bottom of the list. The diagnostic reading assessment has to be completed by the second Friday in November in a regular school year. So if you remember this year, the fall screening was not required, but starting this upcoming school year, it is required. So that date will hold for this coming year. For those students advancing directly to diagnostic, the team also needs to evaluate those first areas that are listed with that asterisk here. When there is also a parent notification component to this as well. So if a diagnostic assessment indicates the student is at risk, the parents have to be provided with information about how to make a special education referral, a description of common indicators and characteristics of dyslexia, and information about interventions and accommodations for children with characteristics of dyslexia. That was all built in as part of the law. So this is the exciting announcement that we have today, is that coming soon, we will have a great resource for you to utilize in this upcoming school year on how to assess students with low incidence disabilities and complex communication needs. We really want to get a clear and accurate picture in order to target specific skills in that personal reading plan with science-based early literacy instruction and interventions. We need to identify and use tools that meet the requirements and provide modifications when needed, or use things like testing the limits or using dynamic assessment strategies. So this new tool will focus on 9 areas that are addressed. Each section provides ideas for IEP teams to determine how to help students access assessments and also provide strategies for literacy assessment. So keep in mind that accommodations should be used on a regular basis. So we're not pulling these accommodations just to do this one test or this one assessment, but we want to be using these types of accommodations if the student needs them on a regular basis so they're used to them. They shouldn't be used exclusively for screening and testing purposes. So in looking at all of these areas, we had a lot of different input from a variety of groups in developing this resource for you. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into students with complex communication needs. So some of the things that you want to look at for students with complex communication needs is first their access. How are they going to access the diagnostic assessment? One way to look at that is, how does the student communicate? And so we provided a link to a graphic organizer on ways of communicating. And then you're going to look at, are they utilizing any type of augmentative and alternative communication? That could be from no tech to light tech to mid tech to high tech. Make sure that their devices are set up so that they can utilize any type of AAC needed in order to help them to take that diagnostic. Do they need any type of switch access? Are they utilizing things like sign language, finger spelling, visual phonics, cue speech, or Braille? And are those available for them to be able to access that diagnostic assessment? Then we look into we go in a little deeper to what kind of strategies can be utilized. So here's some examples of tools and specific strategies that could be beneficial when assessing students with complex communication needs. So we can look at a link to examples of tools to assess language for complex communication needs. There are links to All Children Can Read, a literacy skills checklist, communication supports inventory for children and youth. And then we list some specific strategies. So if we're looking at an alternate letter sound assessment, we might use things like letter cards for choice making, tactile representation of sounds, and things like that. If we're looking at silent reading of a passage followed by comprehension questions, that might be helpful for some of our students. We can offer 2 or more choice options. We can make sure that their AAC is utilized during this. We can have object choices. We can have tactile graphics representing answer choices, things like that. We can also provide access through adapted books. So things like page fluffers, braille, sensory or tactile added additions to those books. Maybe the books are in a digital format or switch adapted. So really thinking about all of those different types of strategies that will help the child show us what they know. So those are just a few examples of what you might find in the complex communications section. We're really excited to have this tool available to you. And if time allows, maybe at the end, I'll be able to show you a little bit of what the tool looks like, but it's currently under compliance review. So it's not quite ready to release to the public yet. The final step is the personal reading plan. A frequently asked question we receive is, can a personal reading plan be part of an IEP? And if so, what information from the personal reading plan needs to be included in the IEP? So nothing under IDEA would prohibit an IEP team from incorporating this personal reading plan into the IEP. If the personal reading plan is included in the IEP, all required components of a personal reading plan have to also be documented in the IEP. So whether or not to include this personal reading plan in the IEP is a decision that's made by your local education agency or LEA or your district. So the personal reading plan talks about universal instruction, areas of literacy skill need. It sets literacy goals and benchmarks, has reading interventions and instructional services listed, talks about progress monitoring, additional instructional services that are needed, support strategies for the parents or caregivers, and it also includes a signature of the parent or caregiver after reviewing the plan. Another frequently asked question is, can a speech-language pathologist implement a PRP? The overall response is no. While SLPs address many areas of literacy that impact reading, they're not licensed to teach reading. So if that personal reading plan for a student with an IEP involves teaching literacy skills, then no, we should not be implementing that personal reading plan. But we want you to note that in certain cases, SLPs may deliver some of the services in the personal reading plan when the goals are the same on the personal reading plan and the IEP, and we have the unique skill set to address those. So we have the background and unique skills to address a lot of different areas. If you consider a student with a fluency disorder or maybe childhood apraxia of speech, there may be a case there where the treatment that the speech-language pathologist is doing will cover what is needed as part of that personal reading plan. So we may assist with components, but we shouldn't be the sole person in charge of that personal reading plan. It should really be a team type decision. And for students that do not have IEPs, we shouldn't be part of that personal reading plan. All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa, who's going to talk about our role in MLSS.
Thanks, Dawn. So DPI developed some guidance that may assist you and your teams on how an SLP can support classroom teachers and other educators throughout the MLSS system. And that document is entitled The Role of Speech-Language Pathologists in Wisconsin's Multi-Level Systems of Supports. And there are various activities that SLPs can and should engage in at that universal level to ensure that all students ages 3 to 21 are able to receive speech, language, and communication support in their natural environments. Activities might include professional development and information sharing, partnering with staff, consultation to MLSS teams, and active engagement in MLSS teams. And we are currently working on updating this guidance to include more examples and resources from the field, as well as frequently asked questions. So, SLPs may provide information to educators and caregivers regarding general speech and language development, and informational handouts as well as trainings on the use of effective strategies to use with students in fostering speech and language development can support others in gaining awareness of the language underpinnings necessary for academic success in school. For example, SLPs might share evidence-based instructional strategies to support vocabulary development or direct instruction and modeling of effective speaking and listening strategies in the classroom. SLPs may also join grade level or content area professional learning communities or PLCs to consult with staff on selecting, developing, and adapting academic material to support students and their language needs. When I worked in the schools, we would share information and provide professional development in the early grades, typically kindergarten and first grade. And at the start of each school year, we would meet with each grade level. We reviewed speech sound development, common errors, as well as strategies to support those errors. And we would model for the teachers how they could apply these strategies with students. And then we would offer some follow-up sessions after those first few weeks of school so we could give any additional support that might be needed at that universal level. So in addition to providing professional development and information sharing, SLPs may coach or partner with general education teachers and other staff in determining how to embed speech and language supports into instruction and activities they already provide. For example, incorporating a focus on story grammar into teaching retells or embedding language strategies into centers. Through collaboration and co-planning, SLPs may consult around the utilization of Universal Design for Learning, or UDL principles, in the general education environment, which might include putting scaffolds in place that benefit most learners. For example, the use of visuals or graphic organizers, provision of extra time, and opportunities for choice in how students take in information and show what they've learned. In addition, SLPs partnering with other school staff gain a deeper knowledge of the classroom curricular demands and the language underpinnings that might come into play. And the goal for all is to improve that quality of instructional practices related to language and literacy. When I worked in an elementary school, an EL teacher and I provided some professional development on universal vocabulary supports. We briefly shared some of the supporting research behind the strategies we were presenting on, and then we modeled what this might look like in a classroom during a whole group and a small group reading activity. And although we were only modeling with adults, we were still showing those strategies in action, and it allowed time for teachers to ask questions and share common barriers they might encounter and problem solve how they could work through those barriers. Then we offered to go into classrooms and model a lesson or co-teach, co-support a lesson implementing the strategies. Now, in order for me to go in and model a lesson and co-teach or co-support, I needed to have students on my caseload in that classroom. If I did not have students on my caseload in that classroom, I could only go in and observe the teacher. So one benefit to partnering with someone like the EL teacher was that they had more flexibility as to which classrooms they could go into and support than I did. So that partnership worked out really well. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Anne to talk a little bit more about consultation with MLSS teams.
Thank you, Alyssa. So school leadership teams may consult with SLPs or include them in their leadership team to assist in selecting curriculum and identifying some of the universal screening tools. And the teams may support teachers in developing and adapting academic material to support the students. Since communication is a foundational skill for learning, in school, SLPs are uniquely positioned so that they can make recommendations around universal instruction strategies and practices that support all students, that can prevent gaps in language and literacy development. They might lead discussions at the leadership teams that examine whether universal instruction is setting up the educational environment for student variability in language and literacy, and designing all lessons around a clearly articulated goal, modeling and explaining different ways for students to show what they've learned, and giving student choice in selecting the method in which they learn or take in information best can lead to more universal student success. And in my district, we use some Google extension tools, Read and Write, so that they are available for all students and they can help with their reading and written expression. And in some classrooms, we find people using an AAC core vocabulary board, like in a big poster form. And some of the people in the classroom, the teachers, the staff, can model the vocabulary as it's being used in those situations. Okay, so here are some examples of ways that the SLPs can incorporate student needs related to the components of science-based learning, early reading into their IEP goals and therapy, as well as within the district's MLSS. And therapy can be done in and or out of the classroom. So again, it's the science-based early learning. Early reading skills are based on phonological awareness and all the things that you see listed under there. And then some examples of developmentally appropriate practices are listed on the right. So we can incorporate those in our goals and help the students be successful. Okay, so leadership and problem-solving teams may include SLPs to observe classroom instruction, as well as to analyze the student data from benchmark assessments or classroom assessments that will help identify or help design interventions for students who are not meeting age or grade level academic or social and emotional grade level standards. SLPs may not screen, as was stated before, or provide services directly to students in Wisconsin unless they're identified as having a disability. But SLPs might assist teams in identifying, creating, and monitoring the effectiveness of interventions for students with an equitable MLSS. Leadership and problem-solving teams might include SLPs to observe classroom instruction, as I said, and some of the examples would be vocabulary examples from data analysis, and some in our district too, and I know in many other districts, some SLPs use a program such as the Expanding Expression Tool or the EET. Or they might do pre-teaching vocabulary and creating connections with background knowledge during stories or book reading, or developing vocabulary with compound words, multiple meaning words, roots, prefixes, suffixes, idioms, etc. So thank you. I'll turn it back to Dawn.
Thank you, Anne and Alyssa. So they both provided us with some nice ideas of how an SLP can be involved in MLSS. And I'm adding right now to the chat a question for you all. And if you would put some responses in the chat, and then later after we stop the recording, we can have some of you unmute and share some of the things that you're doing and how you're involved in MLSS in your district. So now we want to jump into some frequently asked questions that we receive about MLSS. So one of the questions that I get quite frequently, both from SLPs and also sometimes from school psychologists, is a question related to oral language, vocabulary, and listening comprehension and the role of the SLP. So I'll get a question such as, so when a student scores below the 25th percentile, how will the SLP do the assessments and provide the interventions for those students? The answer is that they won't if that student is not yet identified or referred as part of the comprehensive special education assessment process. That Act 20, just like MLSS, is a general education initiative. So that's where that work begins. But when students score low on diagnostic assessment areas related to oral language, vocabulary, and listening comprehension, we are allowed to review universal student data or engage in problem-solving meetings for students who have not yet been identified as having a disability. As Anne and Alyssa talked about, we can also observe classroom instruction. We can analyze student data to help identify, design, or modify interventions that are utilized, but we do not provide interventions for students without IEPs. So when there is a referral, and those are the primary areas of concern, it should be noted that there's really a low incidence of oral expression or listening comprehension as a standalone area of the disability category of specific learning disability. It's difficult because teams are looking for interventions for those areas, and DPI states that if our guidance is that if these are the only areas of concern, a speech-language pathologist should really be included as a member of that IEP team, and the team may want to also consider the criteria for speech or language impairment, or SLI. The interventions that are utilized have to meet the definition of a scientific research-based intervention, or SRBI, under that specific learning disability or SLD rule. So in consulting with the DPI SLD consultant, we are not aware of any existing interventions or progress monitoring tools that currently meet the definition of the SLD rule for just those areas of oral expression or listening comprehension. It's important to keep in mind too that special education teachers can provide interventions for students who are already qualified for special education, regardless of that reporting disability category. So when we have students on our caseload that receive services from a speech-language pathologist, and now there are some reading concerns, those interventions that are done when we're considering SLD can be completed by a special education teacher if we're looking at completing interventions. They could also be completed by a licensed reading teacher. The SLP could potentially provide interventions in listening comprehension, but again, we don't know of any interventions that currently meet the requirements of the SLD rule. So DPI's guidance leaves it up to the LEA to determine whether the intervention and the progress monitoring tools meet those definitions in the rule. There is a frequently asked questions document under that SLD rule on the DPI website. Another area we get asked about quite frequently is about screening. And so I put two quotes here from the OSEP's letter to Couillard and also the role of speech-language pathologists in the MLSS. And the quotes are: assessing, observing, or screening individual students who are not eligible for special education or outside of a special education evaluation process is not permissible. And also that SLPs may not screen or provide services directly to students in Wisconsin unless they are identified as having a disability. So we cannot administer individual assessments without consent of parent and following special education evaluation requirements. We can deliver universal screening tools as part of a district's child find, or we can participate on a team to identify universal screening tools for the district to utilize. Keep in mind that screenings are not defined in IDEA or child find. Child find means find, locate, and evaluate. Child find isn't defined by a day or a place, it's really a process. So when you're thinking about the process that your district uses for child find, we want to consider who can provide the screening tools. And the answer is whomever's qualified to administer those tools, especially if those tools are standardized. What can be provided? It has to be a universal process. So nothing additional or individualized to concerns about a particular student. LEAs, or the local education agency, may make the decision on what universal screening tools and procedures are going to be used, especially at the 4K level, outside of those requirements that are already in place for Act 20. And parental consent is not required for universal screening. You have to consider when it crosses over to special education. So we cannot practice special education before receiving consent as part of that assessment process. So again, parental consent is not required to conduct a screening. And so we often get a question, well, what if I have consent of the parent? Can I screen then? no, we can't, because number one, it's not required, and number two, we can't do anything that's outside of that universal process. Then I receive a question often about, do observations require consent? So it really depends on the reason for the observation. If the observation is being done as part of an eligibility determination, or, will the student need special education, then it's likely that that requires consent. So that would be part of your process for your comprehensive special education evaluation. The next thing you want to consider is, what are the next steps you're going to take after the screening? So we really want to consider culture, routines, and opportunities of that child. Keep in mind that a rescreen is not allowed. So we can't say, oh, I'm going to screen this child now and then check them again in 6 months. A rescreen is not allowed. If there are still concerns, then it's likely that a referral should be made at that time. And we should always let the parents know that they can refer at any time, and we can provide suggestions to caregivers on developmental milestones and activities. So here are a few frequently asked questions we receive about referrals in special education. Most of the questions really come down to the information you see on this slide. Any person who reasonably believes that a child is a child with a disability may refer a child for an initial special education evaluation. All referrals must be processed. Teams may utilize existing data when indicating areas of concern and stating the reason they believe the child is a child with a disability. So some of the questions we receive are, can a staff member tell the parents or the team whether the student should be referred? So can a staff member say, this student makes a good candidate for a referral? The response to that is simply what's on this slide. Any person who reasonably believes that a child is a child with a disability may refer that child. If a parent refers their child for an initial evaluation, our districts required to go straight to the comprehensive special education evaluation process without the SLP listening to or screening the student? That is a question that we've received. If the district receives a referral for special education from the parent, the IEP team must start the evaluation. And again, screening cannot be used to delay an evaluation for special education and related services, and we cannot individually screen a student outside of the evaluation process or outside of that universal screening process. Another question we receive about referrals is, should teachers be discussing their concerns and using some strategies that an SLP could suggest prior to jumping right to the referral? Is there a process for managing a referral that we would suggest? So again, any person who reasonably believes that the child is a child with a disability may refer them, but school leadership teams may consult with SLPs or include SLPs on their leadership team to talk about universal strategies that can be utilized in the classroom and attempted with students when there are teacher concerns. When a referral is received for speech and language, can the district send a permission form to have someone observe the student before a final decision is made? So again, no, all referrals must be processed. And even if the parents were to provide written consent for an observation outside of the evaluation, this type of screening is not allowed in Wisconsin. Then we get questions a lot about referrals from medical providers. And I would refer you again to that document that we mentioned at the beginning that's on the resources slide. So information from a physician or clinician outside of schools can play an important role in our special education evaluation and identifying students with disabilities, as well as apply to development of a student's IEP. But while they contribute valuable insights, a student's need for special education may not be based solely on a diagnosis or a medical or clinical recommendation. So similarly, special education and related services may not be prescribed by a physician or community-based clinician. Only the IEP team, which includes the student's parent, can make those decisions about a student with a disability's educational service needs. The next area that we receive a lot of questions about has to do with co-teaching. Are SLPs able to support general education classrooms by teaching a lesson or co-teaching on speech and language skills when that classroom does not have a student with an IEP in the room? So the answer for this one is no. The SLP must have at least one student with an IEP who is on their caseload in the class in order to support or co-teach a lesson. Again, by partnering with classroom teachers, more students are going to benefit from the support and instruction that's put in place than only the students on the SLP's caseload. And we may also meet the needs of students with disabilities in a more efficient and inclusive manner. So situations in which a special education teacher, including SLP, is responsible for targeted instruction of one or more students without IEPs is considered beyond incidental benefit. So here's an example of what this could look like in a district. The SLP could support the third grade team universally, but only have a student in one of the 3 third grade classrooms. In this instance, the SLP could co-teach or support a lesson in that third grade classroom in which they have a student, as long as they're working towards the goals of that student in the classroom as part of their co-teaching. They may consult with the third grade team regarding universal strategies to use in the other 2 classrooms. So it's similar to what Alyssa was referring to earlier with pairing with others, and she talked about pairing with an EL teacher who would go into those other classrooms. So let's talk a little bit more about incidental benefit. SLPs may provide incidental benefit to all students when working with students with IEPs in the general education classroom. So we may co-teach a lesson, and the services have to be in accordance with the IEP, even if one or more non-disabled children benefits from those services. And that's from the U.S. Department of Education. Why is this different from other states? We often get that question, especially when people come to Wisconsin after working in another state. But in Wisconsin, it comes down to 3 things: due process, funding, and licensing. So it's how our positions are funded, what we're licensed to do in Wisconsin schools, and due process rights of students. Okay, so this concludes the recorded portion of the webinar. We'll now stop the recording and see what other additional questions you have, and then hopefully share some of the examples that you have either shared in chat or would like to unmute and talk about examples of what you do in your district.